welcome back. Yes, Ambassador Nkoyo Toyo joins us next. She's a co-convener and chief spokesperson of Labour and Civil Society Front, LCSF. Good morning and thank you for coming on today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well. So, yes, in light of the president's speech, the message we just heard from the chief of staff, the Labour president, and I see that organized civil society is backing Labour for this, they're declaring August 2nd, Citizens Action Day. So, strike, we know they've spoken about strike, now there's a rally. Is there still a need for this, considering the president's speech and perhaps what the chief of staff also did say there?
Well, thank you. And absolutely, I think it's indicative of the fact that if the strike, or the protest did not come up, and the language keeps on changing, we are not on a strike, we are now on a protest. If that didn't happen, we would probably not hear from the president. It's indicative of that. And I think that's not a bad thing in itself, that the president is responding to the fact that the citizens are concerned. I think to that extent we can say that he's listening at least to the concerns. But it also goes to the point that needs to be made as to whether he has actually addressed the concerns of the people whom he was listening to. It's one thing to speak to the nation, it's another thing to speak to the nation on the issues that are before the nation.
Do you think he has?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I must say that with the greatest respect to the Honorable Chief of Staff, Mr. President did rail out a couple of things which we have heard in the past and have heard even more ambitious plans in the past. And what we heard yesterday was nothing.
So what is the key issue for you?
What is what?
What are the key issues?
Well, the key issues for us, first and foremost, is that we're dealing here with massive corruption. Massive corruption in the sense that the subsidy thing is a scam. We know the arguments are all there in the space, in the public space. I don't need to talk about them again. And the president spends, I think, the first 7 or 8 paragraphs of his presentation talking about those who have benefited from the subsidy, and doesn't say a word about what will happen to the benefits that have come out, and rather goes down later on to tell us that he's recovered trillions in the last 2 months from the subsidy, and he will spend a couple of billions on it on us, and things go as they had always gone. There's absolutely nothing we have seen, with the greatest respect to the president, in his speech that suggests to me that we are into anything different from what we've seen in the past.
There are different schools of thought on some of these matters. Some think if the president goes ahead and says, because something, well, maybe he doesn't want to mention those who are perhaps maybe the suspects in the subsidy fraud in the same breath as to his plans and programs to move the nation forward and ensure people can feed the vulnerable and every other person have it all easy, considering the removal of the subsidy. Because if he does that, that has a potential of distracting from what he wants to focus on to deliver. So if he does this, goes ahead, implements this policy, and then much later comes back to address the question of those who are guilty of this, will that help? Or should he, in the same breath, yes, we'll go after these people, but here's what we're doing for the people?
The challenge of doing that is that he gives us up to March next year. New elites, people who will benefit from a system that is embedded in corruption, will emerge, and the cycle will continue. I do not agree with the logic of that. Here is Mr. President going after the former central bank governor, even appointing someone to look into the happenings within the CBN itself.
Yeah.
If he could do that with one man, how much more a system that has existed over several years, continues to exist in many forms, determining the price of the PMS, because we still do not know under what template this PMS is being determined. Some say it's still being done by the NNPC itself. There are many other players in the field. We're still hearing of importation. We've not heard a word about what's going to happen to the refineries. I think there's a lot of unmet conversations. I think what I found a little bit disconcerting about the the presentation yesterday was when even Mr. President, admitted himself that he didn't have other choices than what he presented to us. The president has reached his limit. He said so. This is all I can give you. I wish I didn't have to cause you so much pain, but this is the pain I can cause you.
What do you think about what he says? Sadly, there was an unavoidable lag between subsidy removal and these plans coming fully online. However, we are swiftly closing the time gap. I plead with you to please have faith in our ability to deliver and in our concern for your well-being. Does this count for something?
I may sound a little bit arrogant here. My work and years of experience has been in the area of governance. He doesn't have the structure on ground. The last speaker just spoke about the constitutional reform and all of that. That may be a long-term thing. But he's talking about working with local governments. Many states do not even have a local government in place. He's talking about working with states. I have not heard one state say, I understand what is going to happen in terms of this subsidy. This is all Mr. President speaking to himself.
No, but some people will say that if you haven't, sorry to interrupt you there, the state, I mean, we've seen one or two states. We heard Ogun State come up with a plan. Yesterday, we heard the Lagos State government talk about what they intend to do with transportation. Might be insufficient, but at least there is some talk in that particular area. But I want to...
has a plan too.
Yeah, so we're beginning to hear, states coming up with their plans individually. I mean, Adamawa State government also did say something. But let me take you up on this speech, because indeed, I mean, some of the concerns that you have raised are what Labour has also raised in their response to the speech. They've talked about the fact that the president was silent on refineries and when they'll come on board. He's talked about the fact that you've talked about how the president hasn't said whether he's going to be going after this elite of the elite, which he referred to as being, has been very, very powerful, even to the point where they can threaten a democratic process. So while that is, all there, and Labour has said, you haven't said how you're going to go about that, Mr. President, but looking at another issue which they raised, Labour says that the federal government has, beg your pardon, furthermore, organized Labour has disturbed that while President Tinubu in his speech lavishly praised the private sector for quickly dispensing wage awards to their employees, the federal government has failed to do same for public workers in its employment. It's open knowledge that the review of the national minimum wage is a matter of law, which is expected to happen in 2024. How would Nigerian workers cope with the current reality of hyperinflation and suffering unleashed by the hasty removal of the so-called petrol subsidy to 2024 when the national minimum wage will be reviewed? This is incredible. I mean, that's the statement of Labour now. But some people will say that the president did not mention any time frame within which, that review would come. He speaks of... let me quickly see if I can find that part where he says...
I think what Labour is alluding to, there's been already a process ongoing in terms of the review of salaries, of minimum wage. That has been ongoing for a while. And I think it was expected to be sort of consummated or summarized or reached some sort of agreement by next year, early next year or something. So in actual sense, that process was already being unbundled, So it's nothing out of, it's not necessarily an outcome of this removal of subsidy. But now it has become an integral part of it. So I think that's the point in which they're trying to make.
Yeah, they're being totally honest when they say that, because some people will say, oh, look, it's in the speech. I mean, they were saying something to the effect that it wasn't even mentioned. The president here says, in the same vein, we're also working in collaboration with the labor unions to introduce a new national minimum wage for workers. I want to tell our workers this, your salary review is coming. Once we agree on the new minimum wage and general upward review, we will make budget provision for it for immediate implementation. So is Labour being totally honest when they say that, oh, Mr. President, you haven't said when it is that, our salaries are going to be reviewed or when, there will be an increment?
The thing about the speech is that the speech puts us into a certain sort of time frame. And you started by talking about the lag of time between when implementation and the actual impact of this begins to hit. There's a March timeline, but in terms of those changes in the salary, we haven't heard exactly when it's going to happen. I will not be saying that I entirely understand what the real point about dates are, but I understand the sense in which that is being made. If I had already been discussing with the Buhari government that by such and such a time, and this was already agreed and laid out, this question of the minimum wage will be resolved, and now you come and say to me that that point is being considered again. It is probably the point is, are we going to hear it before the time that was already set for this to happen? Or is it something that is being anticipated?
Well, we know that usually minimum wage is reviewed every 5 years. That's
absolutely, that's the point.
That's what usually happens. Yes. But we also know that right now Labour is in talks with federal government over adjustments that need to be made as a result of this removal. So if they are currently in talks, and Labour does acknowledge that indeed they are, and we've seen visuals of them being in talks, is it really honest to say, look, you know, there's no sign on the horizon for this minimum wage review which you're talking about?
Well, let me put it this way. I think it's a matter of language here. It's a matter of language in the sense that one sees it as we're already doing it, we had already been doing it, and the other one says I'm going to do it, but neither has said this is how long or how soon it will happen. So I guess it's not a question of honesty. I think it's a question of where the language of prioritization comes in, yeah.
Are you disappointed, though, that this statement seems to be short on sacrifices? Because some people have also said that part of what the people are also expecting to hear from government is, you know, the sacrifices that leaders intend to make to also show that they understand what the people are going through. The president keeps telling Nigerians, I feel your pains, I feel your pains. But then people have also asked, you know, as to Mr. President, precisely how are you feeling our pains and what sacrifices need to be made in that area to show that the president really feels the pains of the people?
I think sacrifices is probably a less it doesn't quite convey the concerns that people have in regards to that point. I think it's the absence of goodwill. You know, it's the absence of goodwill completely. You cannot be asking people to make the kinds of sacrifices. And listen, this is touching families. It's really hurting. I think all of us agree. Mr. President himself agrees. This is hurting families. And people are making really, really hard sacrifices. The consequences of this is huge because we haven't yet known what's happening. We're beginning to see some of the possible indications of where people may be going. We saw what happened in Adamawa when people ran into warehouses, or NEMA warehouses, and started picking up things. And now we are having to protect NEMA warehouses across the country and all of that. We do not yet have the full picture of what's going on. So sacrifice in itself is probably not a strong enough word. I hope I could find a stronger word, because the point in question is that there seems to be a sort of disaggregation between the understanding of where the sufferings of the people are and the kinds of positionalization of things where you look at where the government itself is sitting on. You did hear the comment, of course, about the way in which the National Assembly itself looked at the arguments which were being made about the sufferings of the people. So there is genuinely a feeling among Nigerians that not enough is being done to deal with the enormity of what we are faced with. And I think that it's a bigger thing than sacrifice. Honestly, I still continue to think that we are yet to feel that there is an understanding about the level of pain.
What would you like to see in that area?
In terms of the sacrifices? Oh, definitely a cut down in the cost of governance. Absolute cut down. We haven't heard a word about that. What have we lost? What has been given up? We're still buying cars. I mean, cars is just symbolic of the bigger question or the bigger picture. We're still having political office holders appoint 30, 20 personal aides, of which all is brought back onto the economy. You know, we are paying for it indirectly from the so-called savings that we are making now. So we haven't seen a correlationship. And it is the fact that the president, spends about 3-4 paragraphs of his presentation yesterday to direct our attention to that same elite class and what that elite process has meant to the country. And the failure, at the same time, of giving us any indication at all that something needs to be done. There is a tie in all of this, there is a tie. And that's the point that has been made over and over. But I think the point also that I need to say here is that we ourselves do not quite understand why did we have, in the middle of a negotiation that was going on, to raise the cost of the PMS by 70 naira just overnight. The prices went up from 540, was it, to 617. Meanwhile, negotiations were ongoing. Discussions were going on. This is the insensitivity that bothers us.
That's another kettle of fish. But let's quickly take this conversation today, because I think my colleagues have questions for you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Malkwe. And, that's where I'm headed exactly. The difficulty that Labour seemed to have in achieving much with the negotiations. You rightly observed that, while the negotiations were on, the Nigerians witnessed another hike in the pump price of fuel. And, that trust deficit is also evident with the reactions of Nigerians to Mr. President's speech. But what would you say to Nigerians who also think that what would Labour achieve with the planned protest anyway, if it's been difficult for Labour to come up with something significant through the negotiations? Those Nigerians who think that Labour has, disappointed them through the months and, in fact, through the years, every time it has to represent their interests with government.
Let me start by saying that I don't think Labour has disappointed people over the years and over the months with this negotiation. One of the reasons why subsidy has not gone this early, every government has tried to take the subsidy or remove it. It has been largely the work of Labour. It has been largely the work of organized civil society and people who come in there to say, look, this is one thing that is important to Nigerians. We need to keep it. And over the years, too, the government has tried to come up with what it calls palliatives of one form or the other, which hasn't worked. So to that extent, I think there is something there to be said for Labour. But for the protest that is being planned, in the first case, if Labour didn't come up with a planned protest, we probably wouldn't have seen the attempt which was made yesterday by Mr. President to give us some sort of direction in terms of what his thinking was. Now we know where his thinking is. We still see that there is a huge gap between what his thinking is and what the expectation of Nigerians are. It is our legitimate duty and right as citizens of this country to say, Mr. President, this is not good enough. We expect a lot more from you, and to continue to add and put pressure on government to do that which will serve the ordinary citizens. I do not think the speech that was made yesterday addresses our concerns. We just talked about sacrifices. We just talked about the insensitivity, the fact that in the middle of a negotiation, there were hikes. Hopefully now the government knows that it is not acceptable for them to be negotiating and at the same time to be changing the goalpost. So there are many things which we are already putting out there, which hopefully we will hear from the president and hopefully hear from the government in terms of what we disagree with and what we think needs to happen in the course of time. For the ongoing protest for tomorrow, I think we also recognize the fact that if this was not before the government, we probably would not be having some of the details that were laid out and which the president speaks to. So it's an important part of the conversation that needs to happen. It's called accountability to some extent. If you say something, it is the duty of citizens to rise up and say, look, what you have said is not good enough, and we need to see you do much more. And I'm sure the president understands this perfectly well, that this is not about just wanting to counter what government has said. It is also about doing what citizens think is in their best interest and in the best interest of the generality of Nigerians. We haven't seen the goodwill, we haven't seen the sacrifices, we haven't seen the language of a government that is willing and ready to give us new ideas of what needs to happen in order for the country to begin. We still haven't even seen where the turnaround in the economy, which he talks about that will long-term, other than the removal of subsidy, we do not understand what the long-term value, that addition that is coming out of this.
I imagine that several people who are embarking on this protest are patriotic Nigerians. They're concerned, and that's why they want to get their voices heard. But there's this concern as well. I don't know if you've thought about it, what the group plans to do about it. The challenge we always have when people just want to say peaceful protests, you have infiltration and they tend to blame the organizers and the like. So what kind of consideration is the group giving to that?
Well, to start with, I think what the group is doing is clearly something that has happened here in Abuja many times. People do work up to the National Assembly or somewhere and make a statement as to what they want to see and what they believe in. The responsibility of the safety of those who make that statement and the other people who come into it is the business of government. Government needs to know the complexity of society. It's not our business to start asking, is that person passing on the street a hoodlum or not a hoodlum? We are, as citizens of this country, we have a right to make the protest, to be part of that protest. But at the same time, we expect that government itself has a responsibility to protect us. It is a duty. If there are hoodlums, hoodlums are citizens of Nigeria. Something created the hoodlums. And it is part of the responsibility of government to care for the hoodlums. I mean, we use that language all the time, as though those hoodlums are not citizens of Nigeria. What has turned Nigerians into hoodlums? You know, we need to answer the question at some point. And this is the responsibility of the state. They have to protect us and the rights that we have to protest and be on the streets.
So basically, this is a protest, not a strike.
Oh, absolutely not a strike. The strike process is a labor business. It's a language of labor. This is the language of citizens saying, Mr. President, we have not seen the magic bullet or whatever. We have not seen what we expect to see in terms of where we're going with the economy, where we're going with the cost of governance, cost of governance, cost of governance. Absolutely important. Where you're dealing with those who have denied us access to subsidy, which you have removed because it is a fraud. We haven't seen that as well. And we haven't seen enough of how what is being presented will impact on the citizens of the country.
All right, Ambassador Nkoyo Toyo, co-convener and chief spokesperson, Labour and Civil Society Front, LCSF. Thank you for coming on this morning.
Thank you too for having me.
All right, we do have some messages that have come through. Festus says the palliative rolled out by President Tinubu is good, but not enough, as households will still face challenges. Now that oil subsidy is gone, he must focus on growing our economy, create better paid jobs and opportunities across the country. He must also ensure our national debt falls so that we can have more money for education and health.
Oshinawa Kingsley says, beautiful speech from Mr. President, and we appreciate his concerns, but he fails to tell us how crude oil will be refined locally. That will reduce the price of petroleum products, strengthen our currency, increase our foreign reserve, create jobs, among other benefits.
Well, Professor Inakina says Tinubu's nationwide broadcast proving 100 billion naira for 300 CNG buses should be properly invested in cars, SUVs, estate vehicles, and mass transit vehicles or buses that are wholly Nigerian from innocent vehicles. Be giving appropriate time, approval, and assistance to deliver. This will help in sustainability of local industries, review multiple taxation, review the workers' salaries, help generate domestic finance and monies that will help improve our exports to generate employment that are domesticated. And he goes on and on with his recommendations. But that's much we can honestly take. Yeah, we're totally out of time.
Absolutely. We saw your mail as well, Hussein, talking about Labour needing to halt the protest. But that's too much we can take now. We're completely out of time. Have a wonderful rest of your day and month. I'm Ayo Makinde.
Thank you so much for watching. We'll be back again tomorrow. I am Bukola Koka.
I'm Nkoyo Yusuf. Thank you.
And I am Chamberlain Oso. Goodbye.